Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts on this beautiful night be accepted in thy presence, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Thank you for that magnificent and thoughtful reading. I don't need to preach now, it was so everybody. Much appreciated, I'm sure, by all of us.
Pray for my friend Lori as well. It's sort of that.
Yes, we will. We will. Keep her in our prayers. Thank you, dear. So tonight we hear a famous story that we've probably heard a few times before, otherwise known as the centurion's servant, because this man was a Roman army official called a centurion. Why do you think a centurion? Because he probably led 100 men in the Roman army, and he would have had certain qualifications to be this person, this army leader. And they happen to know what they are because there are history books. Now the history books of the time don't say much about Jesus. Only a man named Josephus wrote, and they're not even sure he actually mentioned Jesus. It may have been added afterwards, but there's a few words about Jesus in there. But the history books, of course, do talk about the qualifications of a Roman army leader. That would be important to them. So they say that he should be, and you could probably guess, he should be steady. He should be reliable. He should be a good communicator. He should be a person who is not looking for trouble. That's interesting, isn't it? But he's also has to be one, when there is trouble, to be willing to stand his ground, even if it means unto death. So we can assume, because this man was working as a army leader, that he had all these qualities, at least to some extent. Now, he had some other qualities as well, which we learn about in the story. He had the quality of being able to change his mind. Now, in the American political situation that we're in across the border, we keep hearing on the news that they don't like it if you change your mind. This is what you thought 25 years ago, and therefore you should think the same thing, because they figure you're just trying to change it to make it work for your politics. But if you can't change your mind, you can't grow, can you? So how do we know he changed his mind? Well, he sent Jesus off. He thought at the beginning that Jesus would have to come to his house and do some kind of ritual performance. You know, he had to maybe lay his hands on him, or he had to pray over him, or he had to touch his face, or who knows what. Or maybe get the slave to do something along with him. He was expecting some kind of a performance to be necessary. So Jesus didn't complain about that. He just started out, which is an interesting thing. He didn't question it. So he's on his way, we don't know, maybe halfway there, and another group of Jewish people come that are friends of the centurion, and they say he's changed his mind. He doesn't need you to come after all. And the reason he didn't need Jesus to come after all is because he had come to the realization that if Jesus indeed had the authority of Almighty God, then he didn't need to go anywhere, did he? He could do whatever he had to do from his own place, from wherever he was. He didn't need it. And he said, besides, I'm not worthy. So now we find out, because of course he has authority over Jesus officially, because the Jewish people were under occupation and the Romans had the power. But he says, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, to come into my house. He's also been thoughtful, because it was one of the rules of Judaism that the Jewish people were not supposed to go into the home of someone who was a Gentile. And I want to say a couple of words about that in passing, because we think, when we think about that, it seems to, like at the the first thought about us is, who do they think they are? Why do they think they're so special that they can't go and eat with people and they can't do this or that with other people? So I just want to point out that in Judaism, the point of all these ritual laws about what you can eat and what you can't eat and who you can eat with and who you can touch and who you can't touch were not intended to be against those people. They weren't looking down on those people, but they had a set of rules to show God that they could be disciplined. So they wanted God to know that they could be disciplined, that they would only eat certain foods, that they would follow a lot of rules. And of course that they thought that that's what God wanted. So it was intended, at least initially intended, to honor God, to show honor to God. So that's just a passing comment, because I think that the centurion came to realize that he didn't want to do that to Jesus. He knew he could force Jesus to go into his house. You know, if he said, like he said, go into my house, and he'd have to go. And he was willing to go, but he said no, because he didn't want him to be ritually defiled in his own mind. He didn't want to cause Jesus any trouble. He just wanted his help. So we know that about him as well. So now we know quite a few things about this man, and then we find out, to our amazement, I think, no matter how many times we hear it, that he built them a synagogue. Now, we don't know if he had money and built it, or if he had soldiers and built it, but whatever happened, it wouldn't be normal for a Roman centurion to be building a synagogue for Jewish people. So that was their way of trying to convince Jesus. Jesus didn't need to be convinced, but they said, well, he built us a synagogue, and he cared about his slave. Can I just do one more aside about slaves? Slavery in those days wasn't a nice thing, but it wasn't like what we imagine, what we know from slavery in North America, which was so brutal, so terribly brutal. And often in the time of Jesus, slavery had a different purpose, and the purpose was that if people couldn't survive and didn't have work and maybe were in a lot of debt or whatever, they could get enslaved themselves for 7 years, and then they would be let free. So there was always an out from being a slave. And also, so they became like household servants, kind of Downton Abbey sort of thing, you know, helping, living with the family and being beloved. Because they said this soldier loved his slave. So we know all these things about him, but he's still an enemy of the Jewish people. He's still a part of the occupying force. He's somebody you're not supposed to like, but we're starting to think maybe this particular one might be a good guy. He might be one of the good guys. So we start to learn, think about our own lives, and think about how easy it is to just take a group of people and say, those are the bad guys. Those are our enemies. And sometimes it happens in a small community, you know, among small groups of people. Sometimes it's your whole nation. These are the enemies. And yes, they are, but every individual person has different qualities, and they're showing us the quality of this Roman soldier. So I want to tell you, if you have time and you're not going anywhere, a little story about another good guy who was also an enemy of the people. And his name was Rabbe, R-A-B-E. He was a German businessman who lived in China, in the city of Nanjing. He lived there in the 30s, and he had been established there as a businessman. And because Hitler was coming into power, you might say he was a Nazi. You know, maybe he didn't understand what all that meant because he was in China, so he didn't really get involved too much. Still, we would look at him and say, that's a German, and that's a Nazi, you know, that's the enemy. And he was in a unique situation to be a good guy. What happened was that in 1937, while he was living in the city of Nanjing, the Japanese forces entered China, and they attacked first in Shanghai, and then they started moving toward the city of Nanjing. We used to call it Nanking. And it's about 5-hour train ride now from Shanghai, kind of northwest. And they were coming and coming closer and closer. And all the Westerners that lived in Nanjing made as hasty an exit as they could. They nearly all left. And only a few people remained. And some of them, a number of them that stayed, happened to be from the denomination that was a sister denomination of mine in the U.S., and that was the Disciples of Christ denomination. And they had built the Drum Tower Hospital there, and the nurses and the doctors that had come from America, they said, we cannot desert these people. And then there was a woman named Minnie Vautrin, who was a teacher at the women's seminary. It was a kind of school for girls. And she said, I can't leave. And Mr. Raba and his wife said, we can't leave. Well, they came into Nanjing, and it is, I'm sure many of you have heard about this, they call it the Rape of Nanking. 1937, started on the 13th of December, and the Japanese soldiers came in and invaded, and the people that were left in the city, there may have been a few soldiers, but not officially. They were women, children, and elderly. That's who was there. So they could have left them alone, but they decided, I guess they had been raised to be warriors, and these people were slaughtered. It is so sad that I cannot still stop crying over it. It's the saddest thing. And in the city of Nanjing today, you still, when the 13th of December comes around, you hear the air raid sirens. And they have the air raid sirens throughout the city. And you remember, and the Chinese people remember. So what did he do? What could he do? Well, he was a businessman. He was steady, and he was reliable. He was a good communicator, and he was a person who could be trusted, just like our centurion. And he went to the Japanese officers, and because he was a member of the Germans, he, a person who was German, they were willing to talk to him. He was not an enemy, you know, he was not an enemy of the Germans. He was an ally of the Japanese. The Germans and the Japanese were allies. So they said, well, you know, he's one of our businessmen. I guess we'll listen to him. And he and 2 or 3 other people had a number of discussions and with the Japanese soldiers. And he said, look, he said, these are innocent people. They're being slaughtered. There were hundreds of thousands killed. He said, we have to establish a safety zone. And the German people would like that. So we're allies of the German people, we better give them something. So yeah, so they established the safety zone, and the next thing you know, Mr. Raba had a lot of Chinese people living in his house, and a lot of Chinese people living in his backyard, and all around him. And I'm not sure exactly how many miles that zone was, but it was a few miles square, and hundreds of thousands of people survived because of that. He saved a huge number of people in that city. And so, when the war was over, he went back to Germany with his wife, and he had smuggled in some photographs, and he had smuggled in some film, and various people had brought things, and he wanted to talk about what had happened. And the German government said, oh no, you don't say one word about that or we're going to throw you in jail. Even though he was a German, they didn't want that to be known, that this thing had happened with the Japanese, because they were allies. So he ended up without a job, with hardly enough to eat, and receiving care packages in the mail from the Chinese people who had practically nothing. And they love him to this day. And they love those people that stayed. And so my husband and I were there as professors at the seminary, but we were connected with that church. It wasn't our church, but it was a sister church. And so because of that, the mission board was joined, they decided that we should be honored and we should be lifted up, and we'd done nothing. So, but we found out the stories about this because of that. And we lived right in the middle of that zone. We lived about 3 blocks away from his house, so we were able to go to his house and see it. And there was a situation where, out of the most horrible thing that could ever happen, one man who decided not to just run away and protect himself, a good guy, one of the good guys, wanted to save the people and is beloved in China to this day. Now the centurion only wanted one man saved. He wanted his slave healed. But he trusted that Jesus could do it and would do it. Isn't it a wonderful thing that he was one of the good guys too? And so, the slave was healed. And Jesus, we learned 2 things about Jesus. First of all, that Jesus can heal us. We don't need the hands-on. We just need our hearts to be open to the kinds of healing that can happen in our lives. And I know that we all need healing in our lives. It can happen through other people, through good guys that we don't know. Sometimes they're the people, the least ones that we expect to be. We need to keep our hearts open to that. And the last thing I'd like to say is this, that it says that Jesus was amazed. That's kind of hard to do, to amaze Jesus, isn't it? Isn't that right? I mean, Jesus was amazed. So I thought you'd like to hear this last little tidbit of information, and that is that apparently in the Bible, Jesus was only amazed twice. Mark 6:6. Oh, I'm quoting scripture now. I believe that's right, Mark 6:6. Anyway, you can check on it when you get home. Jesus goes to his hometown and he's amazed at their unbelief. Isn't that amazing? We're amazed. And now, this person who is not a Jewish person is Jesus is amazed that his faith is so strong that he doesn't even need it to come. So there we have it, Jesus amazed at their unbelief, and many, many, many times in the Bible, you know, Jesus is pointing out that it's the outsider who often has more faith than the person who's, you know, in church their whole life. We try to have faith, but there are people, we need to keep our eyes open for those people. Now, by the way, that man might have been possibly, I wouldn't say he wanted to become a Christian because there was no such thing at the time, but he might have possibly, because he was friends with Jewish people, wanted to become a Jew. So I thought I would just mention why he didn't become a Jew. And that was, there were many, many people, they say, called the people of the way. And those were people who were not Jewish, but they admired the Jewish people for their love of God and for their good behavior and for their kindness and their compassion. And so they looked on them and thought, wow, you know, I'd like to be a Jew. But they couldn't become a Jew for a number of reasons. And one of them was that if they were an adult male, they'd have to be circumcised, and that was very dangerous in those days. Today we have antibiotics and all kinds of things if you get an infection, but in those days, of course, there was nothing. So it would have been dangerous, physically dangerous, and the dietary restrictions would have been hard to follow, right? Because different things that they were used to eating and had access to eat, maybe like the Roman soldiers would be eating the same food, and the other, let's see, the food, the dietary, and so they didn't become a Christian. Oh, and the third thing, of course, was that he would have lost his job. I thought that, and then I found out it was actually true, that if you were a Roman soldier and you decided to become a Jew, you lost your job. So then he would have been in all kinds of trouble. But there were many, many people who wanted to become Jewish, and when the time came in around the year 70, so that would be 40 odd years after Jesus had been on the earth, and the world was changing, and the temple in Jerusalem was completely destroyed by the Romans. There was no temple, the priests were out of work, and people who wanted to become Jewish had an opportunity to become Christian because they could follow all the things, because Jesus was the perfect person for following Judaism. So they were able to then join in. And that's how Christianity began to grow, because it didn't have those restrictions, because it was just about the things that counted, that Jesus had talked about love and compassion. And these two men, the centurion and Mr. Rabba, were good examples for us to think about tonight. And we can be trying to follow God's way by opening our hearts to people who are different from us and knowing that there's love everywhere if we just look for it.